this is not normally when I do writing. I usually save writing with James for the last Friday of the month. But I'm just going to swap places this time around. I was going to do YouTube suggestions this week. YouTube suggestions 23, but it's been a rough few days between work and some other things going on. A lot of my free time was eaten up. I didn't quite have YouTube suggestions 23 ready, and instead of slapping it together, I'd rather just take a few extra days and get it done properly. So I'm just going to switch some things around. I'm going to do writing with James this week. I'll have YouTube suggestions next week. But for the topic, kind of an odd route to get here. What got me thinking about this was I watched a movie. It's a 2008 movie. I just now got around to seeing it. A movie called The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. It's a Brad Pitt movie, and without giving too much away, there is a scene in the movie where someone gets hit by a cab. And where Brad Pitt does some, narrates part of the movie, throughout the film. As a narrator, he starts talking about all the little things that happened that put all of these people in this particular spot at this particular time, like the woman that hails the cab. She left her apartment and realized she forgot her jacket, so she had to go back and get her jacket. And as she grabbed her jacket, the phone rang. She stopped and she talked on the phone for 2 or 3 minutes, and then finally left and hailed the cab. If she had not forgotten her jacket, she would have caught a different cab and gone through that area a few minutes before. Just all these little things that led to all of them being in that spot at that exact moment. And I have several of those things. I think about the stuff like that sometimes. I think about, boy, if I'd gone left instead of right, if I'd done this instead of that, things would be completely different. Just those little things that, sometimes little decisions, sometimes big decisions that can create other things. And it made me think about my grandmother. My grandmother hated to move. And when we left Dallas, moving to this little town, that was a rough one. She really did not want to move, and in fact, when we got here, she spent the first 3 nights sleeping in the backyard. She actually set her bed up outside because she refused to sleep in the house. A skunk came along, and that's when she decided maybe she needed to go ahead and get in the house. Then, 10 and a half years later, when we just moved to the other side of town, it wasn't quite that dramatic, but it was still we still got the grumpy, I hate moving granny. And I can't really blame her because I hate moving too, but she really took it to an extreme. I asked my Uncle George about a couple of things, and it really made me understand my grandmother more. Because I had asked, I always wanted to, my mother and all my uncles and my aunts, they all grew up there at Menard. And none of the family before them were from Menard. And so I asked, how did everybody end up in Menard anyway? Why Menard? Because Menard's just this little town in southwest Texas, kind of close to San Angelo. But it's as a joke, as I've often said, if you're in Menard, then that's where you're going. I just wonder how did the family end up in Menard to begin with? And I want to give Granny's story here about how they ended up in Menard. Because Granny was born in 1915 in Childress, Texas, which is kind of at the very bottom of the Panhandle, a little bit south of the Panhandle of Texas. And her family moved a lot. The only town I can think of that she ever really talked about much when she was living there when she was really young was a little town called Turkey, Texas. And they were really poor. When they moved, they traveled by wagon. And yes, I mean like horse-drawn wagon. And of course, keeping in mind, we're talking about, the 1920s, 1930s. Things were a little different then. They would get somewhere, they would find a spot of land, they'd throw up a tent, and actually lived in a tent. And my great-grandfather would be convinced, okay, well, we're going to go here, we're going to get work, and we're going to start making some money, and all this, and they'd go there, they'd go to the next town, and they'd struggle and claw and fight to get by, just like they always did. And then the next opportunity, okay, well, we're going to go on to the next town where we're going to make there's some opportunities there, we're going to make some money. Well, they just kept doing this over and over. They'd just beat a trail from the Lubbock area south and then over to Corpus Christi and then back again. So Granny, my grandmother, basically spent her whole life just moving. And they couldn't find any roots anywhere. And it was just it never got any better. It never got any worse, but it never got any better. Well, the reason they went to Menard was there was a big natural gas boom in that area. And that's what drew a lot of people there. And my grandmother's grandparents, her father's parents, had actually ended up in that area. When they found out we were going to Menard and that their grandparents were going to be there, and my grandmother was turning 18 years old. Well, she got with the next two oldest. I think her brother JL may have been the second oldest. I can't remember now. He was probably 16 or 17, and then her sister Lenore was around 15 or 16. And she got with the two of them and said, okay, when we get to Menard, you know what's going to happen. They decided that they were going to say anything until he was ready to move, and then when he got ready to go, they were going to say, well, we're not going to go. We're going to stay here with Grandma and Grandpa. She was turning 18. She could get in. Of course, they were back then, we're talking the early 30s, even at 16, 17, 15, 16, 17 years old. The next two oldest would have been able to probably find work. They could stay with their grandparents. Of course, this was all, once they got there, they talked to their grandparents and made sure it was okay first. But that was the plan. They were going to just spring it on him. Well, they got to Menard, and of course it was the same thing, different place. Again, they'd scratch and claw and just get by, and then he was ready to move on to the next one when they sprung it on him. And they said, well, we're not going to go. We've already talked to Grandpa and Grandma. We're staying here. And Granny's mother, my great-grandmother, I guess saw the opportunity. She must have been sick of moving as well. So when they did that, she just jumped in, and instead of, before he could say a word, she said, well, if they're not going, I'm not going. And if I'm not going, the younger kids aren't going to go. So if you're going to go, you're going to go by yourself. And so immediately outvoted, he decided they weren't going to move again. So they all decided to stay in Menard. My grandmother would eventually meet my grandfather. Maybe she already had at that time. They would get married. Eventually have my mother, who years later would have me. All because they got tired of moving. But that was the answer to my question, how they ended up in Menard. That's just where they stopped. I think about those things. What if they had chickened out? What if her mother had not backed them up on that? What if an argument ensued and she ended up losing? She ended up going ahead and going with them, or what if they had picked a different town? What if their grandparents had gone to Brady instead of Menard? What if they'd gone to San Angelo instead of Menard? So if you think about it that way, my great-grandparents a decision that they made to go to Menard during this natural gas boom eventually led to me being born. But I'm sure if you think about it, there's if you've got a good story for that one little decision, or maybe that big decision you made that ended up leading to something more, something bigger, or something that you have that you never would have had if you hadn't if you'd gone left instead of right. Feel free to share it in the comment section. Hope you enjoyed the ride. Hope you enjoyed the story. Next week we'll have YouTube suggestions 23, and I guess for the bonus footage this time around, since we're so centered on Menard, I actually even chose, very rarely do I use specific video. I decided to use the Menard to Brady video for this one. And even our bonus footage is just a little thing that I shot here, there in Menard. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Right there is the road that I always come into Menard on from Brady, and we went for years topped that hill, and it was like hitting a time warp. You would see the same thing every time, and then all of a sudden, this time the view changed. They got something new. A place called Bowie's. You got a big Bowie knife. Now the thing is, this journey for me started in Bowie, Texas. And 4.5 hours later or whatever, I make it to Bowie's in Menard. Yeah, that's not that interesting, but it's the end of the video, so what are you gonna do?